He worked as a janitor at the military academy, telling Vietnam stories to the students. Young officer candidates called him Bullshitter Joe, mocking his tales of heroism. No one believed him until a four-star general visited the academy for a ceremony and saw him. The shock on the general's face caused everyone in the hall to freeze. Welcome to Best Honor Stories. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching this story of silence, respect, and forgotten heroism from. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and help us preserve them. There was an old man who polished the gleaming marble floors of West Point Military Academy every day at the same time, with the same precision. His name was Joseph Martin, but everyone just called him Joe. Among hundreds of young people wearing uniforms, carrying ranks, and preparing to become future commanders, he was almost invisible with his worn work overalls and slightly limping walk. He would enter the building with the first light of morning, clean the corridors, classrooms, and offices throughout the day, and quietly leave as the evening sun set. He had followed the same routine for 15 years, and nobody knew much about him. The Academy personnel records contained only basic information. Joseph T. Martin, 68 years old, Vietnam veteran, single, no emergency contacts. Joe had two distinctive characteristics: his ever-smiling face and his endless Vietnam stories. Students would hear him mumbling to himself while mopping the corridors, sometimes approaching to ask, "Hey Joe, which war did you win today?" They would always get the same response, a slight smile followed by another incredible story. "We were once stranded at the Laos border," Joe would begin, leaning on his mop, his eyes gazing into the distance. "The radio wasn't working, the helicopter couldn't come, and we were surrounded by enemy forces. I had 17 soldiers, most of them wounded. The enemy was patrolling along the line, and we were left with just 3 grenades." The young officer candidates would wink at each other and snicker quietly. Among themselves, they had nicknamed him Bullshitter Joe. Some would make hand gestures behind his back, while others would say loud enough for him to hear, "He was in every battle in Vietnam." "Is he telling Laos stories again?" they would whisper to each other. "You know, last week he told me he cleared a tunnel system in Khe Sanh all by himself. Last month he told me his helicopter was shot down in Pleiku, and he carried a wounded pilot for 30 kilometers. And the laughter would continue. Williams, a second-year student at the academy, was the most ruthless of them all. A tall, athletic young man with a sharp mind, high leadership potential, but an ego problem. "Hey Joe," Williams had called out one day in the cafeteria, with his usual gang beside him, "which medal did you turn down today, the Purple Heart or the Medal of Honor?" As laughter erupted from the surrounding tables, Joe continued collecting trays, just smiled and quietly replied, "I accepted the Medal of Honor, but I didn't want it in the records." This response had caused even more laughter. Matthews, a first-year student, leaned over to Williams and whispered, "The old man has really lost it." The old man never seemed offended. As he pushed his cleaning cart away, his back was straight as always, his steps tired but determined. He would continue telling his stories, whether anyone was listening or not. He would start work every morning at 5:30, cleaning even the most remote corners of the academy. He never arrived late, never took time off, never complained. In rain, snow, or storm, Joe was always there, like a part of the academy as permanent as the building itself. He would watch from a distance as students drilled, sometimes gazing out the window at the training field. There was a longing, an admiration in his gaze. One day a teacher caught him like that, staring at the training field. "What are you thinking, Joe?" Captain Donovan, one of the tactical warfare instructors, had asked. Joe hadn't flinched, continuing to dust the windowsill. "They're not ready," he had said simply, "but they will be." The teacher found this surprising. "Not ready for what?" "The truth," Joe had said, his gaze still fixed outside. "No one ever is." Captain Donovan had looked at the old man for a long time, then just nodded and walked away. From that day on, he would always salute when passing Joe, a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The reason was unclear, perhaps an instinctive respect, or maybe simple courtesy. Most teachers and officers at the academy also laughed at Joe's stories. Some pitied him, while others saw them as harmless fantasies of an old man. Some instructors would occasionally call him to their offices, offer him a cup of coffee, and ask about his past. perhaps out of a sense of responsibility toward the old veteran, or perhaps just out of boredom. Joe would eagerly participate in these conversations but never go into too much detail. I was with the 5th Special Forces Group, he would say. I served mostly on the Laos and Cambodia border. The operations were classified. When more questions came, he would skillfully change the subject or politely smile and say, "That part is still classified." But Joe's stories continued, hour after hour, day after day, year after year. The same cycle would repeat with each new class of students, curiosity, mockery, and eventually ignoring him. However, there was one person who never laughed at Joe's stories, the Academy's librarian, Miss Collins, a woman in her 60s, never married, who had devoted her life to books. Ms. Collins would chat with Joe while he cleaned the bookshelves, quietly listening to his stories. "How did you keep going, Joe?" she had asked once. "In the swamps, under enemy fire." Joe had paused while dusting a book, then replied, "I knew I wasn't alone. My men trusted me, and I could never let them down." There was such sincerity, such weight in these words that Miss Collins had believed Joe was really there, really lived through those experiences. One day, Miss Collins had asked him, "Why don't you tell them the truth, Joe? Why do you let them make fun of you?" Joe had stopped cleaning the bookshelves, smiled slightly. "What difference does it make? They don't need to believe. They just need to be ready." "Ready for what?" Miss Collins asked. Joe just smiled. "They'll understand one day." Time passed quickly. Joe had completed 15 years at the academy. His hair had turned completely white. His walk had slowed a bit more, but he still arrived at the same time, worked with the same diligence, told the same stories. With the arrival of spring, the academy announced exciting news. West Point's 200th anniversary would be celebrated with a grand ceremony. Special guests, retired generals, and important political figures were invited. Students rehearsed for weeks. Buildings were cleaned from top to bottom. Everything had to be perfect. During the ceremony preparations, the academy's personnel manager called Joe to his office. "Mr. Martin," he said in an official tone, "you know you've long passed retirement age. The administration made an exception for you. But now," Joe nodded understandingly, "I knew the time had come," he said calmly. "I'll leave after the ceremony." The manager seemed relieved. He had thought it would be a difficult conversation. "We can arrange a farewell ceremony for you, Mr. Martin. Your 15 years of service." "No," Joe said firmly. "No need. I will leave quietly, just as I came." The manager nodded. Typical Joe Martin, he thought. A quiet, humble man who never wanted to draw attention. On the day of the ceremony, Joe had started work early as usual. But there was something different this time. He would retire after the ceremony. This was his last day at the academy. No one saw this as a big event. He would quietly exit through the back door of the building, just as he had come. Hours before the ceremony, Joe was mopping the main corridor one last time. Williams, now a senior student, about to graduate, was passing by with a group of friends. When he saw Joe, he couldn't resist making one final joke. "Hey, Joe," he called out, "I heard it's your last day. You should at least wear a medal when you leave. What do you say? Maybe a souvenir from Vietnam?" His friends laughed, but Joe leaned on his mop and smiled slightly. "Maybe I should, son." Williams walked away without saying anything more, but something inside told him things were different this time. The look in Joe's eyes was deeper, more meaningful than usual. "You should stop making fun of him," said Matthews, now a senior student himself, walking beside him. "The man is leaving." Williams shrugged. "Oh, come on. We've been listening to the same stories for 15 years. I did this in Vietnam. I did that. Nobody even believes him." Matthews didn't respond, but he felt a strange discomfort inside. Maybe he should have been a little kinder to the old man. The ceremony was to be held in the large gymnasium. Everyone was dressed in uniform, seated in rows. The protocol, academy administration, and special guests were seated in the front rows. Joe had also settled into the back row, an almost invisible corner, to watch the ceremony. He was still wearing his work clothes, but they were clean and ironed. The hall slowly filled. Excitement and pride were in the air. West Point was celebrating its glorious 200-year history, and today was a special day where past and future met. The guest of honor was one of the Army's highest-ranking generals, four-star General Thomas Reynolds, a legendary soldier who had served in countless conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan, from Iraq to Southeast Asia. Reynolds had graduated from the academy in 1970 and risen to the highest position after an extraordinary career. When General Reynolds entered the hall, everyone stood up. His uniform was perfect, his posture majestic. His face bore the marks of his experiences, determined, intelligent, authoritative. Beside him was an equally impressive team, high-ranking officers, military advisors. As Reynolds advanced toward the podium on the stage, his eyes scanned the hall. Being at the academy where he had graduated always gave him a special pride. He looked at the young faces in the hall, the leaders of the future, and then something extraordinary happened. The general suddenly stopped. His eyes were locked on Joe sitting in the back row. The expression on his face transformed from surprise to shock, then to deep respect. The hall sank into silence. Everyone wondered why the general had stopped. Reynolds, amid the puzzled looks of the crowd, descended from the stage stairs and headed straight for the back row where Joe was sitting. His steps were determined, his eyes not leaving the old man for a moment. His team looked on in astonishment. This wasn't part of the program. Reynolds was always someone who strictly adhered to protocol. This behavior was completely out of character. When Joe saw the general approaching, he slowly stood up. The two men now stood face to face. One of the country's most powerful military leaders and the academy's old janitor. The hall held its breath. No one understood what was happening. And then General Reynolds slowly raised his hand and saluted Joe. "Sergeant Martin," said the general, his voice echoing in every corner of the hall. "Seeing you here is an honor, sir." Joe returned the salute. His old body had suddenly straightened, his shoulders tensed, his chin raised. For a moment everyone saw someone completely different in him, a soldier, a leader, a hero. "At ease, General," said Joe, his voice calm but authoritative. "I'm just Joe here." Williams and his friends were in shock. Miss Collins, the librarian, smiled with tears in her eyes. Professors and instructors exchanged puzzled glances. General Reynolds turned to Joe and spoke in a voice loud enough for everyone in the hall to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, before you stands Sergeant Joseph Martin. In 1968 at the Laos border, he crossed enemy lines alone to save 17 soldiers. Despite being severely wounded, he carried them to safety. The only thing he asked for himself was that his name be kept secret." The hall was frozen. Williams's face had turned pale. Matthews whispered to a friend standing next to him. "Damn, the stories were true." Reynolds continued. "Sergeant Martin was nominated for the Medal of Honor, but at his own request, this information was kept confidential. He is one of the most courageous and humble soldiers our country has ever seen." Joe smiled slightly. "I just did my duty, Commander." The general touched Joe's arm. "We all do our duty, Sergeant, but some of us do it in ways others could never even imagine." Then Reynolds turned to Joe. "Today, on the 200th anniversary of our academy, it's time for your story to be told. I want you to no longer remain silent." Joe hesitated for a moment, then nodded slightly. An agreement had been made. Reynolds invited Joe to the stage. The old man limped forward with careful steps. Thousands of eyes were now fixed on him. Thousands of eyes that had thought him invisible for years, laughed at his stories, belittled him. Upon reaching the stage, Reynolds stepped aside from the podium and gave his place to Joe. Joe approached the microphone, cleared his throat, and began to speak. "I'm not a speaker," he said, his voice a bit shaky at first, "but I have a story to tell." And Joe did something he had never done during his 15 years at the academy. He told about his mission in Vietnam, with real details. "In March of 1968, I was sent to the Laos border for a special operation. I was in charge of a team of 17. Our mission was to gather intelligence deep behind enemy lines." As Joe continued his words, everyone in the hall was holding their breath, listening. The story he told was no different from the stories he had told in pieces over all those years. But now, with General Reynolds's confirmation, everyone knew they were true. "We were ambushed. We came under heavy fire. Our radio was damaged. We couldn't call for help. Most of my men were wounded. The enemy had surrounded us, and there seemed to be no way out." Joe told about his emotions, thoughts, fears, and decisions at that moment. how he had crossed enemy lines alone to reach a communication point, how he had called for help, and then returned to carry his wounded men to safety. "I was shot twice," he said, showing his arm that still bore the marks of old wounds. But there was no luxury to stop. Every soldier, every life was too valuable. When the operation was completed, Joe's actions had drawn attention. He had been nominated for the Medal of Honor, but he refused. "There are some things that aren't done for medals," he said from the podium. "Some duties are performed not for applause, but simply because they need to be done." As Joe finished his speech, there was complete silence in the hall. "I'm telling you this today because I want you to understand. True heroism isn't in medals or honor ribbons. True heroism is doing what's right even when you're invisible." When the ceremony ended, students came to Joe one by one. Williams was among the first. His face was still pale, his eyes looking at the ground. I'm sorry, Sergeant Martin," he said in a trembling voice. "I didn't know." Joe touched the young man's shoulder. "You weren't supposed to know, son. No one needed to know." "Why?" Williams asked. "Why didn't you tell us? Why did you stay as just a janitor for so long?" Joe looked out the window at the training field. "Because sometimes being a hero isn't about wearing medals or telling stories. Sometimes it's just about being there, watching and witnessing others grow." Williams nodded. There was a new understanding in his eyes. "We should have listened to you more." Joe smiled. "Maybe now you will. Not just to me, but to all the silent voices around you." That day was supposed to be Joe's last day at the academy, but it wasn't. The next day, Joe came to the academy early as usual. But this time, instead of his janitor's overalls, he was wearing his old uniform. As he walked down the corridor, every student he encountered stopped and saluted. Joe was no longer invisible. The academy commander called him to his office and made an official offer. "Sergeant Martin, we need your wisdom and experience. We need someone to teach our students what real leadership, real courage is. We want you to stay." Joe accepted the offer. His official title was now Living History Advisor, but he would still come in early mornings, sometimes seen sweeping the corridors, sometimes watching students on the training field. Miss Collins was waiting for him at the library door. "They finally learned the truth," she said, smiling. Joe shook his head. "No, they only learned a part of it. They have a long way to go to learn the truth." "What about you?" Miss Collins asked. "What will you do now?" Joe looked toward the large window at the end of the corridor. Outside, on the training field, young officer candidates were marching in line. "I'll keep watching," he said quietly, "just as I've always done." After that day, Joe's story became a legend at the academy. It was told to every new class of students. No one laughed at his stories anymore. On the contrary, they listened to every word carefully. And Williams. After graduation, he was sent to Afghanistan. At his first post, his unit was trapped in a conflict. Williams remembered a story Joe had told, used the same tactic, and safely extracted his entire unit. When he returned, he found Joe and said, "Thank you." Joe just smiled. "I didn't do anything, son." "No," said Williams. "You taught me the most important thing. Sometimes being a hero doesn't require medals, titles, or applause. Sometimes just being there and doing your duty is enough." Joe nodded and squeezed Williams' shoulder. "Now you're ready, son. Ready for the truth." Today there's a small bust of Joe at West Point. Underneath it simply says, "Sergeant Joseph Martin, served silently, taught silently." And in the corridors of the academy, a legend still lives. The story of the old janitor whose stories no one believed, until a general recognized him. So now I ask you, has there ever been someone like Joe in your life? Someone who walks around quietly, unnoticed by anyone, but who actually has an extraordinary past? Perhaps the greatest heroes are those who don't tell their stories, who don't show their medals, who just quietly do their duty. At Best Honor Stories, we believe that true heroes aren't those with the loudest voices, but those with the biggest hearts. Thank you for watching. If this story touched you, subscribe, share, and help us keep these voices alive. We'll see you in the next story, and until then, pay attention to the silent heroes around you. Perhaps the most ordinary-looking person has the most extraordinary story.